they went quiet.
Welcome to the You Are Not So Smart podcast, episode 122. In the 1970s, a psychologist named Henri Tajfel developed something called social identity theory, which basically said that when we define ourselves, we do so in large part by asserting our loyalty to the groups to which we belong. Tajfel's experiments showed that humans can enter into us versus them thinking in seconds, and they will do so over just about anything.
Through a number of experiments and decades of research, what he eventually discovered was that, first of all, the more intense a conflict is, the more you think of your competitor as an outgroup member, not as an individual.
That's political scientist Liliana Mason.
I am Liliana Mason. I am a political scientist in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I specialize in political psychology and American political behavior.
Ah, well, you must be very busy then.
Yeah. No, someone recently, people keep saying, isn't this an exciting time for you? It must be such an exciting time for you. And someone recently used the analogy, it's sort of like, when there's an Ebola outbreak and people ask medical doctors, isn't this a really exciting time for you?
Wow. Oh my God.
Similar.
As Mason mentioned, Tajfel's social identity theory posits that not only do people form groups very easily, but once they do, once their individual identity is tied up to their group membership, they tend to see people who aren't in those groups as lesser than in some way.
So this is like a crucial part of the theory. So as conflict increases between two groups, it's much harder for you as an individual to think of anyone who you're competing against, any political opponent, as an individual person who may have, characteristics and qualities and good things about them and bad things about them and flaws. And instead you just think, you're them and therefore, our conversation's over.
Them. It's a powerful word, and the research in both psychology and neuroscience says that because our identities have so much to do with group loyalty, thinking in terms of us versus them is an essential property of the human brain. And if activated, if stimulated, we can't help ourselves but to think in a tribal way.
It's a very natural and kind of primal psychological response. It's not anybody's fault. It's just the way that our brains work.
Tajfel grew up in Poland, and as a Jewish man, he had become fascinated with answering the question of how one group could hate another group so much that perpetuating genocide could become reasonable, could become reality. He studied prejudice throughout the 1950s, and at the time, the assumption across most of social psychology was that warlike animosity between groups was based on aggressive personalities rising to power, or a history of conflict over land, or grievances over a perceived slight. Tajfel was skeptical. He looked across many different examples of conflict and genocide, and he thought that the differences that people claimed as the source of their hatred seemed arbitrary, rooted in meaningless categorical differences, not world-defining ideological differences. Tajfel wondered what would happen if you could strip away every single salient difference between two groups of people so that there were no biases or prejudices between them. That is, if you made people into nothing more than, say, Group A and Group B, or even strip that out, make people just Group Red and Group Blue. And then add one small meaningless difference at a time, like one group wears hats and the other doesn't. At what point would people start showing animosity for the other, for them? When would they show favoritism for their in-group and bias for their out-group? If he could find that point, he thought it would establish a baseline for prejudice and discrimination. But what he discovered was that there is no baseline. Any noticeable difference of any kind will reliably stimulate the behavior that flows from tribal psychology. For instance, in one of his studies, he gathered subjects from a school in Bristol, people with identical backgrounds, many of them friends, and then sorted them randomly into two groups. But he didn't tell them that the sorting was random.
And what they did was, and these have been replicated, hundreds and hundreds of times. What they did is essentially just tell people in a lab, one of them was, look at this page full of dots and estimate how many dots there are. And then randomly people were told either that they're overestimators or underestimators.
Each person looked at a page of 40 dots for half a second and then estimated how many they had seen. Now, Tajfel didn't really record their answers. It was a coin toss that determined whether you were told you were an overestimator or an underestimator. But with that, you became a member of the overestimator group or the underestimator.
The person is alone in a lab at this point. There are no other people around.
So, alone and now sorted into a group, Tajfel then asked each subject, since he was already there, could he help Tajfel's team with another experiment? He said he wanted to see how people made difficult choices. And among those choices he presented were these allocations, splits of a given amount of money that would go to other participants in other experiments. For each amount, the money would not be split evenly, but a little bit more would go to one group than the other. The twist was that the groups in these other experiments completing tasks to earn rewards were labeled as overestimators or underestimators. What Tajfel found was that even though there was nothing binding overestimators or underestimators to the groups, nothing binding those people to any sort of group identity other than those labels. I mean, they had just been told they were in one or the other moments ago. And even though they weren't getting any money themselves, subjects tended to split the money in favor of their own group every time, even when that meant the people in the other experiment would receive less money overall, including members of their own group.
Essentially what people did was not only did they give more money to their in-group than they did to their out-group, but they were given a choice in some of these experiments between, let's say, everybody gets $5, the overestimators and the underestimators. Everybody gets $5, or your group gets 4, but the other group gets 3. So essentially they were choosing between the greater good of everybody and their group's victory at a cost.
This was a shocking finding for Tajfel, and he repeated this experiment in a number of different ways, and he found the same thing every time. For instance, if people looked at paintings by two abstract artists who had similar styles, and then subjects were told they were in a group of people who liked artist A or they were in a group that liked artist B, people would then do all sorts of things in follow-up experiments that showed favoritism for people that liked the same paintings that they had, and they showed bias for people that didn't like those paintings. Going even more simple, Tajfel told people ahead of time they would be sorted randomly into groups with names like Group 40 and Group 15, and still, knowing they were randomly sorted, people exhibited favoritism toward their imaginary in-group and bias toward their imaginary out-group. After many experiments built on these foundations, social psychologists found that there is simply no salient shared quality around which opposing groups will not form, and once they do form, people in those groups immediately begin exhibiting tribal favoritism, tribal signaling, tribal bias, and so on. And that's why this is called the minimal group paradigm. Humans not only instinctively form groups, they will form them over anything, no matter how arbitrary or minimal or meaningless. One of the amazing takeaways from this work is that the origin of opposing tribes and groups and parties and any clustering that leads to partisanship is often something random and out of the individual members' control. Where they were born, the religions they inherited, the schools they attended, the food they eat or don't eat. And these starting conditions are like specks of dirt around which forms cultural pearls. Whatever political disagreements two groups may have, whatever tribal disputes they may have, those battles might not really be about the issue in question. Instead, the opposing positions are often merely justifications for the us versus them emotions that naturally flow from group formation. Us is a kind of cognitive glue, a biological adaptation to encourage people to work together. But as soon as we group up, we begin expressing our baked-in tribal psychology, and so the counterpart to us begins to become inflamed. Them. And as Tajfel's research found, the first kernel of us versus them is ensuring that your group is better off than outsiders, even if that diminishes your own potential well-being.
In order to have a society, you have to have some reason for membership, right? There has to be some rules for being a part of a group of people. And if you're part of a group of people, that group has to have boundaries. If it doesn't have boundaries, then you're not really a group. You're just everybody. And there's a scholar, Marilyn Brewer, who basically defined this by saying, we have a psychological need for both inclusion and exclusion. So we need to feel that we are part of something, but we also need to feel that not anybody can be part of it in order for us to feel important ourselves. We need to feel like we're included in some group and that there are outsiders. There are some people that don't get in. So there's something that makes you special. And the underlying idea behind social identity theory is really self-esteem based. So we need to be part of groups to enhance our own self-esteem, to feel good about ourselves as individuals. We have to feel that we're being accepted by a group and that group has status. And as long as that group has status, we feel good about ourselves. When the status of that group is threatened, we start feeling bad, and then we have to do things to improve the status of the group. So that's why when there's a conflict between groups, we start fighting a lot harder, because the conflict between groups is really a fight for your own self-esteem and sense of worth.